Get that started. And I have 7 o'clock on the dot. We will give folks a few minutes here. There we go. Everybody's where they're from. So we'll go ahead and get started then. So on behalf of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and the Ephrata Cloister Associates, welcome to the June 2022, our second anniversary of the Ephrata Virtual Academy programs. For those of you not familiar with Ephrata Cloister, it was founded in 1732 by a German immigrant named Conrad Beisel and consisted of celibate members as well as married members and their families. Education was always an important part of Ephrata, and so we continue with our academy programs to honor that memory. And there's another one there, it's still coming in. I will go ahead and turn the program over to Michael Showalter, our educator, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. So Michael.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us again. As Elizabeth mentioned, our second anniversary. Tonight's speaker spoke on our program, I think in one of our early sessions, maybe 2 years ago. Michael Harris is with us this evening. He's a graduate of the University of Mary Washington and the American Military University. He's worked for the National Park Service at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and at Fort Mott State Park in New Jersey, and at the Pennsylvania Historical Museums Commission's Brandywine Battlefield. He's conducted tours and staff rides of many of the East Coast battlefields. Michael is currently a secondary education and teacher and teaches in the Philadelphia region. He lives in Pennsylvania with his wife, Michelle, and his son, Nathaniel. And his first book, the subject of his visit with us early on, was called Brandywine, and it has received an award from the American Revolution Roundtable of Richmond in 2014. His new book, Germantown, makes sense because it followed the Battle of Brandywine. We're going to look at the Battle of Germantown this evening, and it's just a delight to have Michael with us again. So Mike, thank you for being here, and we'll turn the program over to you.
All right, well, thanks for having me. I hope everybody enjoys this tonight. Feel free to ask questions at the end, and we'll deal with those. Now, before I dump you right into the middle of Battle of Germantown, I feel the need to at least provide a little bit of background on how our two armies got to this point in the 1777 Philadelphia campaign. So I'm just going to give you a real brief explanation on how we get to October 4th. So the campaign really started up in North Jersey in the spring of 1777. There were some minor maneuvers, some minor skirmishes up there in May and June. Largest engagement was at a place called Short Hills, which is near where Plainfield, New Jersey is, in June of 1777. But ultimately, William Howe is going to choose to take his British army, or a big chunk of it, from New York City, put them on the ships of the Royal Navy, about 267 ships, and they're going to go out to sea. He loads 18,000 personnel. Now, they're not all combat troops, that's support personnel as well, but 18,000 people are put on those ships. And then they go out to sea, late July 1777, or mid-July 1777. When they do, George Washington really isn't sure where they're going, because when that fleet disappears over the horizon, they can't see them. And there really is no Continental Navy that can track where that fleet is going. And so Washington's going to have to wait a long time, hoping that that fleet is spotted passing somewhere along the coastline. Because they could be going north to Boston or Canada, or south, not just to Philadelphia, but several other ports to the south, like Charleston or Savannah. So it's going to take a while. Eventually, they're spotted passing Little Egg Harbor, New Jersey, which is roughly near where Atlantic City is today. And Washington starts marching from the Hudson River Valley south, trying to get to Philadelphia. The British briefly move into Delaware Bay, down by Cape May, at the end of July, July 31st, and they have to make a decision. Do they land somewhere along the Delaware, or do they go back out to sea? And I'm going to give you just a real brief explanation of this. There's a big chunk on this in my first book on Brandywine if you're interested in more detail. But ultimately, William Howe had told the king he would only land near Philadelphia if Washington was still in New Jersey. Well, when they get to the Delaware Bay, Andrew Hammond, who's the captain of the HMS Roebuck, who was on blockade duty in the Delaware River, gives false information. I'm not sure why he did this or where his source of information was, but Hammond tells William Howe that Washington is in Pennsylvania. He was not in Pennsylvania yet. They were getting close. They were in the Trenton area, but they had not crossed the Delaware River yet. So based on that intelligence, William Howe is going to go back out to sea. Why is that important? They could have landed in a day or two, either in Wilmington or Chester, PA, and been in Philadelphia within 3 days, and there was nothing Washington could have done to stop them. But when they go back out to sea, it's going to take them an additional 4 weeks to get to where they're going, giving Washington a lot more time to get ready and to build his army up to a larger strength that it would be for the Battle of Brandywine. So the British go back out to sea. They spend another month at sea, going around the Delmarva Peninsula and up to Chesapeake. And they start to land near where Elkton, Maryland is today, in the northern reaches of the Chesapeake Bay on August 25th. That same day, Washington marched his army into the outskirts of Wilmington, Delaware. You then have some maneuvering and skirmishing through northeastern Maryland, northern Delaware, with the largest engagement being at a place called Couch's Bridge in northern Delaware on September 3rd. And then you have both armies paralleling each other up opposite sides of the Brandywine River, crossing the Pennsylvania state line between September 9th and 10th, setting up the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th. Largest land engagement of the war, and that is roughly 3 weeks before the Battle of Germantown. That's all covered in my first book. So then this book starts with how they get to Germantown from Brandywine. So after Washington retreats from the Brandywine battlefield, because he loses there, he regroups and he starts to maneuver into a position to block the roads leading to the Schuylkill River. Because once Washington lost Brandywine, the Schuylkill River is the next natural barrier to protect Philadelphia. William Howe has to cross the Schuylkill to get to Philadelphia. So Washington wants to block access to all the river fords on the Schuylkill River. And that's how you get an engagement at near where Exton, Pennsylvania is today, roughly, or Immaculata College today. And you get this thing called the Battle of the Clouds on September 16th. It's the day William Howe marches off the Brandywine battlefield, and Washington's in a block, or trying to get into a blocking position to block a road junction leading to the Schuylkill River. And it's called the Battle of the Clouds because a massive rainstorm breaks out, causing the weapons of both sides to not work properly, partially because of damaged ammunition, partially because the pans of the firelocks get wet and the gunpowder won't work in a wet fire pan for the firelock. And so you have a couple minor skirmishes on two different roads, but ultimately the Battle of the Clouds never really happens into a major engagement because of the rain. But it destroyed Washington's ammunition. So he retreats far to the northwest to get access to supply depots near Reading, Pennsylvania. And when he does that, it allows William Howe to maneuver closer to the Schuylkill River, not far from Valley Forge, actually. Not quite in Valley Forge Park, but near there. But he can't cross the river because all that rain had flooded the Schuylkill River. So he has to wait several days for the river to subside so he can get across the Schuylkill River. During that time, and while Washington's getting new ammunition and regrouping, Washington left behind one of his divisions, Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvania division, and they maneuvered in behind the British camp. So if you can think of this, you kind of visualize this. The British are camped between the Schuylkill River and Anthony Wayne's division. They're kind of caught in the middle of those two things. But loyalists informed William Howe that Anthony Wayne was back there, And Anthony Wayne wants to eliminate that threat to his rear. Or I'm sorry, William Howe wants to eliminate that threat to his rear. And he sends a detachment to attack Anthony Wayne on the night of September 20th and the 21st. That's how you get the Battle of Paoli, or the Paoli Massacre, that took place near where Malvern, PA is today. With that threat eliminated, William Howe starts to maneuver up towards the Schuylkill. He tricks Washington into thinking he's going west, and Washington basically pulls away from the Schuylkill River, exposing all the fords, and Howe crosses at a place called Fatland Ford, which was directly behind where the George Washington Chapel is today in Valley Forge Park. That's where the British crossed. By September 25th, they have maneuvered from the Norristown area, what's today Norristown, down into Germantown, the village of Germantown, and that's where they camp on the 25th. And on the 26th, they send a column from Germantown into occupy Philadelphia officially, beginning the 9-month occupation of the city. And then over the next 8 days, Washington slowly maneuvers from what's today northwestern Montgomery County. He inches his army closer and closer to Germantown. And by October 2nd, I think it is off the top of my head, he has camped in what's known as the Methacton Hills, not far from the Peter Wentz Farm, which is today a Montgomery County historic site, not far from the modern town of, I can't think what town that is. Anyway, not to confuse you, near the Peter Wentz Farm. And that sets up the Battle of Germantown. So why does he feel the need to attack Germantown? Let's go there first. All right, why is this not, there it goes. Okay, why the need to attack Germantown, or what's Washington hoping to gain? Well, since the Battle of Brandywine, over that 3-week period, William Howe has detached a number of units from his main army to occupy other areas of the Philadelphia region. He has sent troops to Wilmington, Delaware. He has sent troops to Chester, Pennsylvania. He has sent a very large detachment in the Philadelphia proper. So why is that important? Because the army he has camped here in the Germantown, here's Germantown, a village about 6 miles outside of Philadelphia in the 18th century. The army that's camped here is a shadow of the army that had fought Washington at Brandywine. It's not as big of a force that they had used to attack Washington at Brandywine. Now, yes, Washington has lost troops at Brandywine. He lost troops at Paoli. He lost troops at the Battle of the Clouds, but he's received reinforcements. He has gained a brigade of Connecticut troops, as well as New Jersey and Maryland militia that were not with him at Brandywine. So he is about equal in size, his available force, to what he had available at Brandywine to defend the Brandywine River. So he is a pretty strong force, and Washington and William Howe has about 2/3 of the force he had available for Brandywine. So Washington thinks he has an advantage, and he's going to launch an attack on this camp at Germantown, hoping to defeat this detachment of the British Army. That's the goal. Now, the plan Washington comes up with to do that is exceptionally complicated for 18th century warfare. Now, his plan is to send 5 different columns down 5 different roads to attack the British camp at the same time on dawn October 4th. They're going to leave in the evening of October 3rd from their camps up here in the Methacton Hills. Worcester, there you go. I have it on the map. That's the town I couldn't think of, the modern town. They're going to march on 5 different roads and try to hit this camp at the same moment the next morning. Ambitious. So let's break down those 5 columns. All right, the column that has the farthest to march is all militia troops. It's commanded by this guy. This is William Smallwood. He's in overall command of this column. And he's got Maryland militia and New Jersey militia. For those of you that may be familiar with roads in the Philadelphia area, I'll throw out some modern road names, but not overly complicated for anybody that might not live in the area. So they are going to march down Morris Road to Bethlehem Pike, just a short distance down Bethlehem Pike to a major intersection here for this battle. This is the intersection of Route 73 and the Bethlehem Pike. It's where McGurk's Tavern sits today, where the Philadelphia Round Table meets. This White Marsh Church, a modern version of it, still there. This is a major intersection for the battle. It's still a pretty busy intersection today if you visit the spot. So they're going to go just a short distance down this Bethlehem Pike, then make a left onto what's today Route 73. It was called Church Road back then. They go all the way down the Old York Pike, or no, the Old York Road. Yeah, Old York Road. And then they make a right on the Old York Road to attack the far right flank of the British camp. They have the farthest to go. They're also the first column to depart the camps in the Thacton Hills because they have the farthest to go. That's why they leave first. The next column is under the command of Nathaniel Greene. It contains several entities, the Connecticut Brigade, Greene's own division, and then another division of Virginia troops under Adam Stephen. They are initially going to follow Smallwood down Morris Road to Bethlehem Pike to this busy intersection. They're also going to make the left on Route 73 and start marching, but they turn before Smallwood. Smallwood has to go all the way out to here. Greene turns on Limekiln Pike, which is roughly where Arcadia University is today, and they make a right on the Limekiln Pike to come in on the right front or the right center of this British camp. Okay, next column, John Sullivan's column. Again, multiple entities. We have Thomas Conway's brigade, mostly Pennsylvania troops, Sullivan's own division, and then Anthony Wayne's division, the same division that got beat up at the Battle of Paoli. They're on a different road. They take Skipback Pike, which is again modern Route 73, to this crazy intersection at Bethlehem Pike. So think about all the troops that have to pass through this intersection. They make a right though. They don't go on Church Road or stay on Route 73. When they turn on Bethlehem Pike, they stay on it all the way down to the village, what's today Chestnut Hill, the shopping district today, if you're familiar with the area. It was a little village then. They take it all the way down the Chestnut Hill and they make a left on the Germantown Road, or what's today Germantown Pike or Germantown Avenue, depending on where you are on it. And they're going to come in down the main road down into Germantown. Following them is another division, a reserve division under Lord Sterling. So they have to follow Sullivan on the same roads. And he's got the New Jersey Continentals and the North Carolina Continentals. Okay. The other two columns are Pennsylvania militia. One of those columns, 1,000 men, with John Armstrong, the division commander, personally leading them, is going to come down. They actually depart from where Norristown is today and march down what we call Ridge Pike today, or Ridge Avenue. Back then it was called the Manatawny Road. They march all the way down that into where Manayunk is today to attack the far left flank of the British camp, right along the Schuylkill River here. The other Pennsylvania Militia Brigade under James Irvine is actually on the other side of the river. Their job is to march all the way down here, roughly to where 30th Street Station is today in Philadelphia, to put on a big show here and to put on a demonstration to keep the British troops that are in Philadelphia from rushing up the Germantown reinforcements. They're meant to hold those reinforcements in place. That's the purpose of Irvine's brigade. That's crazy complicated. So just process this for a second. 5 different columns, 5 different roads, no GPS, no radios, no cell phones. They have to march all night in the dark on narrow roads, many of which are tree lined and you can't see very far from them. The odds of them pulling this off were slim to none. So the shocking thing is they pulled it off. All 5 of these columns got to where they were supposed to be, probably within about 15 minutes of each other, and all started to attack within about 15 minutes of each other. It's rather shocking that they pulled that off for 18th century warfare, but they did. So even though this is all kind of happening simultaneously, to make it a little easier on you, we're going to break down each column one by one, how the battle initially goes, the positives of the battle. All right, so John Sullivan's column is definitely the first ones to fire. Probably about 15 minutes ahead of Nathaniel Greene's column, they launched their attack. Thomas Conway's brigade's the first one to go in. They're going to hit an area known as Mount Airy. There was a house there, but there's actually a little mound there or a hill there where Mount Airy gets its name from. And they hit the picket posts of the British 2nd Light Infantry Battalion. So I'll give you a couple quotes here. This is Benjamin Talmadge of the American Dragoons. He says the troops were put in motion, and in a few moments the firing commenced. The outposts and advanced guards of the enemy were driven in with great precipitation. This is Martin Hunter, one of the British officers with that light infantry battalion. He says the day had broke about 5 minutes, but it was a very thick, foggy morning and so dark that we could not see 100 yards before us. Just as the battalion formed, the picket ran in and said the enemy were advancing in force. So you're going to see here, there's several references to the thick fog that morning. And what's going to happen is not only is the fog causing vision problems, as the battle really starts to intensify, the black powder smoke from these muskets is going to mix with the fog and make it even harder to see. Okay, so so you have Conway initially attacking, then Sullivan deploys his entire column. So now you have 5 infantry brigades attacking 1 light infantry battalion. These guys are exceptionally outnumbered. And so I give you some quotes from all this here. This is Captain Enoch Anderson, Delaware officer. He says, we pushed down all fences in our front and marched to the battle. Again, it was a very foggy morning. Bullets began to fly on both sides. Some were killed, some wounded, but the order was to advance. We advanced in line of the division. The firing on both sides increased. And what with the thickness of the air and the firing of our guns, we could see but a little way before us. Again, that's a reference there to that fog and the battle smoke mixing. Back to our friend Martin Hunter, the British officer. They do try to regroup and counterattack. The problem is, because of the fog, I don't think the British knew just how many troops they were up against. And Martin Hunter's a quote here explains that. He says, on our charging, they gave way on all sides, but it again and again renewed the attack with fresh troops and greater force. We charged them twice till the battalion was so reduced by killed and wounded that the bugle sounded to retreat. Indeed, had we not retreated at the time we did, we should have been all taken or killed, as the columns of the enemy had nearly gotten around our flanks. This is Adam Hubley, Pennsylvania officer with Anthony Wayne's division. He says, on our side, our men behaved with the greatest bravery and repulsed the enemy, and with the charge of the bayonet, took their encampments and pushed them before us hard. This is Friedrich von Munchausen. He's a Hessian officer serving on William Howe's staff. Now, as the morning starts, he's not in Germantown. He had been down in Philadelphia delivering orders to Charles Cornwallis. But he hears the firing from Philadelphia and he rides like a crazy man up Germantown Road from Philadelphia into Germantown. And now he's trying to find William Howe in the chaos. And he rides into this mess. And he says, the British held off the vehemently attacking enemy for a time, but then had to retreat after heavy losses. I arrived just at that time and was astounded to see something I had never seen before, namely the English in full flight. So the Americans were driving the British back. All right, let's shift over to the Pennsylvania militia column over here under John Armstrong. And just a couple quotes from these guys. This is John Lacey, Pennsylvania militia, and he admits the militia didn't do what they were supposed to. He said, had they equally acted their part with that of the center, commanded in person by Washington, and pushed the enemy's flanks with spirit and alacrity, as they ought to have done, they must have been, they, meaning the British, must have been prevented of forming a second line as they did without opposition. These militia guys are up against Hessian Jaegers. And this is Johann Ewald, one of my favorite guys, great diary of the war. This is Ewald's, a piece of his account of the battle. He says the Jaegers, of which only the picket had been engaged, counted 3 killed and 11 wounded, most of whom died from their severe wounds after several days. The reality is that the militia don't push that hard. But I'm going to give them a little bit of credit here. If you're not familiar with this area, this is the Wissahickon Creek. Today, Kelly Drive twists and turns along the Wissahickon Creek. A lot of people use it to avoid driving on the Schuylkill Expressway. But if you've ever driven along Kelly Drive or taken your life in your hands to do that, the Wissahickon Creek is in a gorge and it is surrounded by rock cliffs, really steep ones on both sides of this creek. and there was no bridges here in the 18th century. So I'm going to give the militia a little bit of credit here. When they got to the top of this cliff, I don't know how they were going to get across to attack the Hessian Jaegers. So I'm going to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt here that because of the terrain, they were limited in what they were able to do in this battle, even though they did not turn the British flank like they were supposed to. I don't know how they were going to be able to do that when they encountered this terrain, to be just frank about it. Okay, let's shift over to the other side of the British camp. So here's Sullivan's guys. These are the guys we just covered. Now we're shifting to the east or to our right. And Nathaniel Green's column. And we'll get some quotes here of Green. Now Green, again, if you're familiar with the area, he's attacking across the campus of LaSalle University. That's where he's sweeping across, if you're familiar with the area a little bit. This is Charles Talbot, a sergeant in the 6th Virginia. It says, we drove them immediately and so continued to drive them. We ran over their dead in great numbers. This is Matthew N. Kettle, 17th Regiment of Foot. This is a British officer. And I'll explain this in a second. Let me read the quote first. The rebels moving on lined a bank and rail under cover of the fog and threw in a most severe fire upon the 4th Regiment, which had been ordered to the left of the 1st Light Infantry and which knocked down almost the whole of their right wing. What's he talking about here? Russell's brigade here, this is a Virginia Continental Line Brigade. They advanced down this road here. This is Church Lane. The road's still there. And in the 18th century, Church Lane was like a sunken road from years of wagon traffic. So if you can think of a depressed road like you would find at Antietam or Shiloh on a Civil War battlefield. And then both sides of the road had post and rail fences running along it. So the Americans are down in the low part of this road, almost like a trench line. And they can see, like, their heads and maybe even their chests are just at the top of the road bank. And they could see under the fog the legs of the 4th Regiment of Foot. They could see them lined up. And they literally laid their muskets on the bottom rail of the fence and fired a volley into the 4th Regiment of Foot and knocked down half the regiment. That's what that quote was talking about. Devastating volley. Most 18th century volleys are not that accurate or deadly. This one was. All right, some more quotes. This is John Marshall, who will go on to be Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court after the war. He says, the country through which the enemy was pursued abounded with strong and small enclosures, which everywhere broke the line of the advancing army. The darkness of the morning rendered it difficult to distinguish objects, even at an inconsiderable distance. Let me clarify what he's saying now. Now, the village of Germantown was a linear village. All the structures, churches, houses, etc., were lined up along the road over this roughly 1.5 to 2 mile stretch. But they had deep yards. Their properties extended perpendicular to the Germantown Road, well off the Germantown Road. And all of these deep yards or fields were fenced. So what Marshall's talking about is as they're advancing, they have to cross all of these fence lines to get at the British, which was disrupting their formations. Okay, this is James Grant. He's the British general in command of this half of the British camp or army. He's a bit pompous and not entirely honest when he wrote this letter, but he says the American attempt was bold, but when it came to the push, they failed totally in the execution. He was just uneasy for 10 minutes, which is ridiculous. His entire wing, he was in command of all of these guys. This entire wing gets crushed and driven back to and beyond the Germantown Road by Nathaniel Green's column. So to say that he was uneasy for 10 minutes is a little bit arrogant. Now, granted, you're going to find out here that the British are going to turn the tide, but he was definitely uneasy for more than 10 minutes. This is Joseph Plum Martin, at this point a private in the Continental Line, one of the great memoirs of the war by an enlisted man on the American side. And here's his quote, or one of his many quotes on the battle. He says, that drove the British quite through their camp. They left their kettles in which they were cooking their breakfasts on the fires, and some of their garments were lying on the ground, which the owners had not time to put on. Affairs went on well for some time. The enemy were retreating before us. Okay, turn on. Oh, here's another quote of that attack along the road there with that sunken road. This is another officer in the British Army. He says, the enemy's column following the road leading to Germantown, which run along the whole front of the 4th Battalion, and probably not having seen the light infantry battalion, faced to the fence and leaning their pieces on the bottom rail, for it was a hollow road in that part, fired on the 4th Regiment. The point-blank volley knocked down 50 men. Again, devastating volley. All right, our last column is the Maryland and New Jersey militia. And I just got a couple quotes here for these guys, and then we'll talk about what went wrong. This is Asher Holmes, New Jersey militia. It says the Jersey militia and the Redcoats, one of the regiments in the New Jersey Brigade, was wearing captured British Redcoats. So it's a little confusing. And the Maryland militia drove the enemy when we first made the attack. The fire was very severe and the enemy ran. And just a British quote from this fight, Richard Fitzpatrick of the British Guards remembered being surprised by their army coming down upon us and making a most desperate attack. Surprising indeed in every sense of the word, for we had not above 2 hours notice of their advancing and then gave no credit to it. So what went wrong? That's the big question, right? What went wrong? Let me get a sip of water here before I continue. Everything's going great. And unbeknownst to the Americans, because in all the fog and the confusion, the Americans kept pushing south on this map. And they didn't know that 2 companies of the 40th Regiment of Foot, commanded by Colonel Thomas Musgrave, ran into this house. Now, we're not talking about a lot of people. 2 companies, maybe 60 guys, 70 at the most. 60 is probably closer to the number. And they started to barricade themselves inside this house. This was the home or the country estate of Benjamin Chew, who was the Attorney General of the colony when it was still a royal colony prior to the war. It's also known as Cliveden. That's the name that the Chews used for it. But this is the house today. It's a modern photo, well, a couple years old now. So you have 2 companies starting to barricade themselves inside this house. But the Americans have pushed beyond the house. So you can see the American line here, and the house is now behind them. This is Musgrave, the colonel that did this. It was a big deal to him. When he had this portrait painted of himself after the war, he has Cliveden painted in the background behind him. That's how big of a deal this was. Okay. How do the Americans find out they're in there? Well, this is Timothy Pickering. He's the Army's adjutant general. He's the senior staff officer for Washington. And he remembers getting orders. They're riding down the Germantown Road behind the American lines. And he remembers a very heavy fire of musketry. General Sullivan's divisions down here, it was evident were warmly engaged with the enemy, but neither was in sight. So they hear all this rumbling gunfire, but they can't see what's happening. So Washington turns to Pickering and says, I am afraid General Sullivan is throwing away his ammunition. Ride forward and tell him to preserve it. So what does that mean? It's just a way of saying that Sullivan is wasting ammunition by shooting at things they can't see. And if they keep doing that, they're going to run out of ammunition. So he wants Pickering to ride forward and find Sullivan and tell them to make sure they can see what they're shooting at. And so that's what Pickering does. He takes off riding down the Germantown Road, past Cliveden, and he finds Sullivan down here by the Mennonite church. And he says, I rode 300 or 400 yards beyond Chew's house, met Sullivan, and delivered to him the general's orders. It's while he's riding back that he realizes that there's a problem. So he starts to ride back, and this is when he gets shot at. The first notice I received of it, meaning the house, was from the whizzing of musket balls across the road before, behind, and above me as I was returning after delivering the orders to Sullivan. He turns to it, now he's on his horse riding back, and he looks to his right, and he says, I saw the blaze of the muskets whose shot were still aimed at me from the windows of a large stone house standing back about 100 yards from the road. Now I realize, oops, let me go back real quick. I realize this is a modern photo, and I realize it's hard to see because these trees were not there in the 18th century. But if you could kind of peer through the trees, you could see the house back there. So he's riding from our right to our left when he gets shot at from this house. All right, and he gets back and he finds Washington probably sitting on his horse, probably a group of officers on their horses in the road in front of this house, which still stands. This is the Bensel house. Today, this is 2 blocks north of Cliveden, modern city blocks. But in the 18th century, this was the next property north of the Chew house. So it was completely open from the Bensel house to Cliveden. But again, with the fog and the smoke, I don't know how much they would have seen of Cliveden, but it was open ground in the 18th century. And what Pickering finds when he returns here is there's a heated argument, maybe discussion, occurring about what to do about this house. Let's get a drink of water here. Keep moving. What are we doing? Okay. All right. And he gets there, and Pickering recalls. Now he writes about this many years after the war, but he recalls that in Washington's presence, this question: whether the whole of our troops then behind should immediately advance, regardless of the enemy in Chew's house, or first summon them to surrender. So remember back at the beginning, I said there was a division that was marching behind in reserve. It was Lord Sterling's division. They have not been engaged yet. And they're debating what to do with that division, whether to send it forward to help Sullivan continue to push deeper into Germantown, or use them to root out these British troops in this house. That's the argument that's going on. And the 2 players in the argument are going to become Timothy Pickering and Henry Knox, the Army's chief of artillery. And here's our boy Knox. And what Knox says is that it would be unmilitary to leave a castle in our rear. Now, in hindsight, I would argue that they should have left 1 regiment in front of that house, a couple hundred guys, just to keep an eye on it and not let those British troops out, and send everybody else forward to reinforce the front line and continue the successful attack, or what was successful at that point. I think Knox was wrong. Washington chooses to listen to Knox. And so, let me continue here, Pickering's discussion here. He responds to Knox saying, "We are now in the midst of the battle and its issue is unknown. In this state of uncertainty and so well secured as the enemy find themselves, they will not regard a summons, they will fire at your flag." So what Pickering's saying here is, if you send somebody up the driveway of that house with a white flag, asking them to surrender, they're going to shoot at that person. That's what Pickering's saying. And that's exactly what happened. So the first thing that happens is they send, is it William Smith? Yeah, they send a staff officer, William Smith, up the driveway with some kind of white rag, white cloth. I'm not sure exactly what they did, attached to some kind of a sword or a stick. I don't know what they were using. They're not specific. Up towards the house to summon them to surrender. And Pickering remembers that I imagine they would pay no respect to the flag, they being well posted, and the battle far enough from being decided. The event justified my apprehensions. In a few minutes, Smith was brought back with his leg broken and shattered by a musket ball fired from the house. Smith dies a couple days later from that wound. Now, I'm going to give the British a little bit of credit here because it's very dishonorable to shoot at a white flag. But remember, we keep talking about all this fog and smoke. I'll be honest with you, they might not have even seen that white flag. They might have just seen an officer walk up the driveway and shot at him. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they might not have actually seen the white flag blending in with the fog. So the white flag doesn't work. So what they do now is they line up a battery of artillery to start to pound the house. It's actually Thomas Proctor's battery, Pennsylvania artillery. They actually position themselves in the yard of, I think it's called Uppsala. There's a post-war house directly across the street. Basically, if we were standing right here today, this is the front yard of the house called Uppsala, which was not there at the time of the battle, but that yard is where this battery was. And they start to blast the front of this house. Guess what? That house is pretty thick granite. Not going to knock the walls down. What it does do this is also, I should make it very clear. This is field artillery. This is not naval artillery. This is not siege artillery. These are not big guns capable of knocking down a fortification. These are small field pieces that can follow infantry in the battle. We're talking 3-pounders, at the most 6-pounders. These are not big, heavy siege warfare guns like you'd see on a ship or at the siege of Yorktown. So they're just incapable of knocking this house down. What they do is they damage it. There was all this nice statuary in the yard. Again, this was a country estate. They start blowing the heads off statues and arms and limbs off statues. They blew the urns off the top of the house. They shattered windows. They blew the front door in, but they don't cave in the walls. So that didn't work. So now they line up infantry, that reserve infantry that hasn't gotten into the battle yet, line up. The North Carolinians, basically right at the edge of the property between the Bensel property and Cliveden, and the New Jersey Continentals under William Maxwell right along the Germantown Road here. And the next thing that happened, and I don't think orders were actually given for this. I can't find in any of the documents that this was actually ordered. I think Elias Dayton, the colonel of the 1st New Jersey, just kind of did this. And then the 3rd New Jersey just sort of followed him. And so what you end up with is 2 of the 4 New Jersey regiments start to charge up this driveway towards the front of the house. Like this. And you get this fight in the front of the house. And there's multiple post-war paintings showing this. This is one. This is the one from the cover of my book of them trying to charge into the front door. This is a picture I took from inside the house from the 2nd floor, looking out one of the windows into the yard. So you imagine you've got all these guys charging up this driveway and this attack coming towards the front of the house. This is a pretty modern image of the British trying to defend the inside of the house and keeping the Americans out at the front door here that have been blown open by the artillery fire. But this doesn't work. They can't get in the house. So if you've tried to ask them to surrender and that didn't work, you've tried to blow the house open with artillery, that didn't work. You've now attacked the house with infantry, that didn't work. What option do they have left? They're going to try to set the house on fire. Now, this is a stone house, but they're going to try and set it on fire. And so here's another image of this attack. And if you look here closely, they are pushing a wagon up to the side of the house filled with straw, and they're going to light it on fire. This doesn't work either, by the way. Well, one of the officers trying to help do this that gets wounded is this guy. This is John Lawrence. His dad is Henry Lawrence, who will be the president of Congress about a month after the battle, replacing John Hancock. So this is a pretty important kid. And he gets shot through the shoulder trying to do this. Very severe wound. He survives that, but will be killed later in the war in 1782. So this doesn't work. Well, keep in mind, this is making a lot of noise. This is a lot of commotion and rumble of musketry and artillery shots. This is a cacophony. And all the guys that had advanced past this house that we had talked about earlier start to hear all this noise behind them. And again, in the fog and the confusion, they start to wonder, what did we leave behind in the fog? Now, again, I don't think orders were issued for this, but you start to have companies, eventually whole regiments, turn around and start to head towards the sound of all this noise to their rear. And you're going to end up with friendly fire incidents because in the fog, they're going to start running into each other in the fog and shooting at their friends. All right, and you also get a brigade come from Nathaniel Greene's column. So you end up with a lot of troops heading towards Cliveden. Something like this. And one of the things that happens, there's a myth out there that the British had artillery inside of this house. No way, there's no way there was artillery inside that house. What happened, I think, is the brigade artillery that was attached to McClanahan's brigade, Virginians, set up and started shooting at the back of the house, this artillery, and missed. And those those shots that were missing the house hit the troops, the American troops on the other side of the house. So these Americans think they were being shot at by British artillery, but the reality of it is it's coming from McClanahan's brigade artillery. All right, so what that allows is, because everybody's starting to turn around and head towards Cliveden, it allowed the British to regroup and the launch of a counterattack. And so I'll give you some quotes from the counterattack here. This is Anthony Wayne, who says, "We ran away from the arms of victory, ready and open to receive us." This is George Whedon, one of the Virginia Brigade commanders. He says, "By some means or other, the right wing gave way, which encouraged the enemy to rally and press forward. The left, his own column, shortly after was also broke, and a general repulse took place instead of a victory, the most important, had we attained it." A couple British quotes for you. This is an officer in the light infantry. He says, "The officers hallooed out loudly, charge. The enemy turned about, fired, and started to run forward through the camp. So the Americans are retreating. One of my lieutenants was mortally wounded and a very few others. Pursued the enemy who were forming and threw down their arms." So the Americans, who had been winning, start to throw down their guns and surrender themselves. That's what he's describing here. This is a corporal in the 49th of Foot, Thomas Sullivan. Says, "After we fired the first volley, they ran towards the center, leaving their prisoners loose." So the Americans had captured a bunch of British guys, and now they're afraid, and they start to let those prisoners loose so they can get out of there. Well, the British later formed immediately and took to their arms. So imagine these guys that had just been prisoners are now loose. They picked their guns up off the ground, and they reformed to join the counterattack, firing upon the enemy with the greatest ardor. The left-hand company of our regiment took 63 of that party, who upon their approach threw down their arms, the battalion still pushing on. What ends up happening here is the 9th Virginia gets completely surrounded, and almost the entire regiment ends up surrendering. If you're familiar with Don Troiani's work, his newest piece of artwork on the Revolution is a scene of this 9th Virginia getting surrounded at Germantown. What else does this allow? The British advance to Cliveden and allow Thomas Musgrave's 2 companies to come out of the house and join the pursuit themselves. And now you have the Americans in full retreat, and they retreat far, actually off this map. They retreat all the way to Pennypacker Mills, another Montgomery County historic site, which is in the modern town of Schwenksville. It's actually off of this map. It's so far away, I couldn't even fit it on this map. Not to scale anyway. So just to give you an idea, the Americans left from the Methacton Hills near Worcester, or Worcester, marched all night, attacked at dawn, fought a sustained fight for about 4 hours, then retreated past where they started from, off this map to where Schwenksville is today. Give you an idea, some of these regiments, between marching and fighting and retreating, went 45 miles in 24 hours. It's a stunning distance. But that's how the battle comes in. The British stopped their pursuit here at White Marsh Church, which is where that crazy intersection is we were talking about at the beginning of the talk. That's where they call off their pursuit and they come back to Germantown. But that's how the battle comes to an end. So let me see how my timing is. Oh, it's pretty good. All right, so I'll be happy to take any questions. If anybody's interested in talking for a different group, or I do tours, but if anybody also would like a signed copy of one of my books, would like to get one direct from me, you're more than welcome to email me. My contact information's there. But I'll be happy to take any questions you guys have.
Mike, while we're waiting for some questions, do you want to talk about Don Troiani's work a little bit?
I can.
It's just general. While we're waiting,
Yeah. So
questions.
If you're not familiar with Don Troiani, he's a historical artist that does an extensive amount of research before he even puts brush to paper, or canvas, I guess is the word. He's most known in his early years for his Civil War studies, but he's in more recent years delved into other wars, like the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. But it's an extensive amount of work. He researches primary documents to find out exactly what kind of uniforms people were wearing, what specific weapons a specific regiment was issued. So he gets all those details correct, and then he gets models to pose each pose in his battle scenes before he paints them. So I mean, it takes him years to do a painting. It's actually stunning when you see one of his finished works, but that's kind of a basics of what he does.
And is the exhibit still up at the American Revolution Center?
I think that's a good point. I forgot about that. I think it is. So if you're familiar with the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, I'm pretty sure it's still there. Their current exhibit is of his artwork, of his different battle scenes of like Saratoga, Lexington and Concord, and I can't off the top of my head, I'm having trouble. Bunker Hill. He's got some paintings for the Battle of Long Island. His Germantown painting's not there because he didn't finish that until after the exhibit was being established. That's a very new painting. But I understand, because I follow him on Facebook, he's working on some more Philadelphia campaign paintings that he's in the middle of. So very interested to see those. Yeah.
They're amazingly lifelike. If
Yeah.
you get a chance to, and I think you can find some images online as well.
Yeah, you can. I mean, if you Google Troiani, stuff will come up.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any questions come in. Nobody has questions. Wow. How can that be?
Somebody raised a hand.
Oh, Sandra, if you want to go ahead and type your question into the chat box, we'll be happy to answer it for you. Oh, there we go. All right. Yep. That's just a comment. Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you, Miriam.
I don't know how, can they unmute to ask their question?
They should be able to unmute themselves. We usually don't, just because it gets kind of chaotic, but
Trying to see if if she might not know.
yeah, let me see if I can. Let me get the participant list up here. Come on.
Yeah, if she has a question, I'd be happy to answer it.
Yeah, I'll ask her to unmute, and then maybe she can ask her question.
Oops, did I do that?
No.
I think I did. I think I hit up. I think I did that.
That's okay. I think you're okay. I don't know.
Hello.
Oh,
I'm unmuted.
there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Did you have a question?
No, I'm so sorry. I have more of a comment.
Oh, go ahead.
I saw you and you presented your Brandywine book in Bound Brook some years back.
Oh yeah,
and
that was a while ago.
Yeah, I have that book, and I'm going to get the Germantown one because my ancestor, Conrad Seibel, was in both these battles. He was in the Philadelphia Regiment. He was militia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I went to a family reunion of all kinds of descendant relatives, and we watched a reenactment of the Germantown one. I have some really cool pictures that I took. but yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Oh, no, well, thank you. That's fine. I was afraid you had a question and we weren't going to be able to answer it. So, but that's fine.
No. There's probably a lot of things to ask questions about, but I don't have one. But thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
Thanks, Sandra.
You're welcome.
All right. Well,
We might be all right.
you must have answered all the questions,
I
right?
did that well, Beth.
You did that well. So I'm going to go ahead and